Sometimes when we begin to question our faith or have doubts about our tradition, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert. When we take a step back and honestly evaluate organized religion in the 21st century, many times it doesn't make any sense. The more we cling to it and try to save it, the worse it becomes. In addition, widespread abuse, cover-ups, and victim shaming cause some of us to question whether it will ever be right again.
The Desert Sanctuary was created by Karl and Laura Forehand. It consists of a podcast, a blog, along with Karl and Laura's writing.
We're happy you're here. Welcome to the show. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. I'm Laura Forehand, and I'm here with Karl Forehand. And before we get started, and before I introduce our esteemed guest today, I thought I would kick it over to you and see what you have to share.
Yeah, not really too much today because we want to get to our guests. But for sure, we've been kind of piling videos out there onto our YouTube channel or my YouTube channel, Karl Forehand. So like for the Leaning Forward conference, all those speeches that are in there. And I made, for most of the books, I've made kind of a set of videos to go along with them and never had any way to use them. So there's just kind of accumulated out there. And we're going to start putting these podcast audios on YouTube also. So there'll be a picture come up and
then they can listen.
And they can hear it just like a podcast, just another way to get our podcast. We've got a lot of those out there, 10 or 15 of those out there. So subscribe to my YouTube channel. Every time I promote it, it goes down a little bit.
Oh my gosh.
So I really don't know how to promote things. I just keep talking. Eventually, maybe something works.
Yeah, you know? That's all you can do.
That's all you can do.
Yeah.
Well, Laura, would you like to tell the audience about our guest?
Yes,
when
I will. I know. No, you're all good. No, I'm really excited about this conversation today. We have Dr. Mark Gregory Karris on the podcast, and he is a licensed marriage and family therapist in full-time private practice in San Diego, California. He specializes, in religious trauma, men's issues, and couples therapy. He is a husband, father, and recording artist. Mark is the author of the best-selling books Divine Echoes, Reconciling Prayer with the Uncontrolling Love of God, and Religious Refugees, Deconstructing Towards Spiritual and Emotional Healing. Welcome to the podcast. We're so glad that you're here today.
Hello, Karl and Laura. How are you guys?
Good.
Doing pretty good.
Good.
Yeah.
Cool.
We're ready to do this. We're excited about it. And
ready to rock.
Yeah. So what, Mark, you and I have become friends during my real hard time. You were one of the people that was there for me and ended up writing the foreword, I think, to my book called Being, where I talked about my healing. You're kind of there through all of that. You know, we didn't do a therapy session or anything like that, but your presence with me in a couple of times like that makes you more than just a regular friend to me. So we're excited to have you on today.
But we want to be here.
Yeah, we want to hear your story today. Whatever detail you want to give about your past, about the book you're promoting right now, and anything else, but just fill us in on who Mark is.
I have to tell myself, don't think too deeply, but yeah, I mean, I've been around a bit. I think we did a podcast together back in the day.
Yeah.
My story is just one who, pretty rough, wild, kaleidoscopic early childhood experience, trauma, violence, murder, mental illness. So pretty difficult, grew up then cutting and pretty lost as a kid. Suicidal ideation, and when it sort of culminating into this event that, tried to, in my life in a very unique way, but then it was sort of synergistically coming to dance with my experience with religion, and in particular oneness Pentecostalism, because my twin brother became a Christian about a year or so before me. So he'd always be telling me about Jesus. But fast forward to a lot of different wrestling within myself and inside, and some weird spiritual experiences, I eventually gave my life to Jesus. And what that meant is, I remember there's sort of a BC in sort of after Christ moment. I was just in a field, lost and depressed, and I just raised my hands. It sounds dramatic as I talk about it, but I raised my hands and I said, God, if you're real, then show yourself to me. And in that moment, I just wept and cried and felt something that transcended myself. As what I would consider a master deconstructionist, I try to deconstruct that narrative, and it's hard to do it. There was no fog machines and people around, and so it just was a palpable experience that changed the trajectory of my life forever. So that was sort of the beginning, and then in and out of churches. One is Pentecostalism, and then I wound up working in a Korean church for 4 years, Korean Presbyterian, going to a Methodist school, working in a charismatic church, being ordained as a Southern Baptist, working in a Pentecostal church, and just all across there. And so a lot of wrestling and deconstructing and being what I would consider experiencing religious trauma. And now as a therapist, I just have a real heart for people who are struggling through religious trauma or adverse religious experience or religious disorientation growth syndrome, or spiritual abuse. And, those terms can be teased out a bit, but just have a heart to help people on the journey. Yeah.
It's good. So, other things, do everything. You're, a musician, band kind of person. You also write books, and you have full-time counseling practice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do a lot of things, but mental health, it seems. One of the people we were talking to yesterday brought up mental health and trauma, and we talked a lot about that. But what's the status, in this country, within faith communities of a lot of us are just have trauma, at least unaddressed trauma, but lots of mental health issues. Is the mental health crisis bad or terrible or good?
Karl, am I allowed to curse?
Sure.
I was going to say we are effed. It's, I hate to think so broadly in a sense, because there's so many different experiences. But as a society, and even those who are in religious communities and outside of it, there's plenty of trauma to go around. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, cultural and spiritual and familial and national and international. And it's hard. I mean, depression and anxiety and suicide and drug addiction and domestic violence, and especially after the pandemic, the research showed a lot of that stuff sort of skyrocketed. So it's, there's plenty of trauma. And the word trauma derives from the Greek word for wound or injury, and psyche is sort of the Latin term for soul. I like, what's his name? Russ Harris's word, sort of soul wound. So kind of combining that in a poetic sense. And so, we all have soul wounds. And then given environmental stuff, then, the biggest country who has the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons is sort of very tenuous, and we don't know what's going on there. And I just heard from somebody, a client yesterday, matter of fact, they said, I'm in talks with people high up in the climate change and that discussion. They said, 2050, it's the end of humanity. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is And so it's so interesting because I'm at a point as a therapist where I'm like, of course you'd be anxious. Like, I'm not going to pathologize your dis-ease when it comes to your experience in this world. Anxiety and depression and worry and frustration and rumination. And for me, perhaps the mentally ill are those who do not experience any dis-ease because they're engaging in such a form of a defense mechanism of splitting that they actually can say, all is well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my question to that would be, how does the institution of the church play into that? And the reason I ask that is because, when we were involved in ministry and in church, there was a lot of bypassing with that kind of language, like God's in control, all is well, just have to trust. Like when you're talking about, those that are kind of disassociated with reality, maybe in a sense, I mean, how much do you feel like, religious institutions play a hand in that, if you can speak to that?
Sure. I vacillate between hating religion and looking through a compassionate evolutionary lens and understanding where it comes from and what it could potentially offer human beings. But the trauma and bypassing and just the keeping human beings from reality and becoming greater catalysts to change reality is so enormous. And there's such minute details in how religion can function in that way, to a person not knowing who they are or what they want because they're sucking on the teats of the mother of the religious institution. And when they separate a little bit, there's complete disorientation because it's sort of this fostered dependency by those who are in power actually like it, but those who are not in power do not realize those deleterious effects of religion, keeping us enslaved and from actually doing more good rather than harm in the world.
Yeah.
So you in the book, the first section of the book actually identifies some of that specific trauma that comes just from the way I understood the story. You're writing in the Deconstructing Hell book. You had a chapter in there, and you explained, about church trauma, church harm, and so on, associated with that belief. And then you decided to write a whole book after that, right? So that book, and the first part is about trauma that comes from hell-like beliefs, or however you want to describe it.
Oh, right. Part one. So the book is called The Diabolical Trinity, Healing Religious Trauma from a Wrathful God, Tormenting Hell, and a Sinful Self. And I realized the Trinitarian nature of this because hell, as I was writing about hell, you can't separate hell from a wrathful God who created it. And you can't separate hell from, you need sinful people to be put there. So it is this sort of entanglement of these three major doctrines that have caused so much suffering in various forms. And so part one is sort of teasing that out, the anxiety, the effects on the body, the toxic shame and nagging self-criticism, betrayal trauma, and rejection from the community. So a lot of different nuances of how the diabolical trinity can really affect us negatively.
Yeah. And in the second part, what I remember, I'm kind of looking at notes, but I don't have the book.
Sure.
I mean, it's been a little while. But it more about in the second part that those actual beliefs. You're real kind and you don't go after anybody or anything like that. But it seemed like a real gentle discussion you were having in that second part of the book. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I really, compassion is such a big part of who I am. I realize everyone's in different spaces and places, and vehement anger and rage and a complete disillusionment about the church for many folks makes a lot of sense. What I try to do in part 2 of the book is just share a couple of, so part 1 is sort of the problem, how the diabolical Trinity affects us. Part 2 and part 3 is how maybe we can heal. And then part of that part 2 is focused on untangling and wiggling some of the hell beliefs from our minds, where part 3 is focused on how to untangle it from our nervous systems. Because with hell trauma, the whole point of that being trauma, one can't be talked out of trauma. This is deeply within the nervous system, subcortical nervous system. So I sort of teased it out that way. And I do, in my part 2, I sort of have a thesis. And I'm coming from a psychological, sociological, philosophical sort of framework within part 2. But my thesis is that an internal place of torment called hell does not originate from God, but is rather a result of creative human ponderings about the afterlife, morphing into a narrative of violent projections that create a glue that binds communities together. And I think the hell narrative also feeds human pride and has definitely been used throughout history by people in power to subjugate dissenters for the sake of homogeneity, but also to prosper the people in power as well. But I also then in the last chapter in that part, I talk about the absurd notion that our intuitions about God, that our intuitions about compassion, goodness, and wise discipline could be more loving and healthier than God's. So it's so interesting because I made it a point to not talk about the Bible. Like, I may have like 3 verses in the entire book, and it's not about my biblical understanding. And it was so interesting to write without Christianese, and it was fucking liberating. It was so interesting because in my book before this, Religious Refugees, the divine, maybe more through a process panentheistic lens, I'm sharing about God and God's all throughout that being relationship God and all that good stuff. But this, I'm going through, I'm just going to write as a therapist, sociologist, which I'm not a sociologist, but through that lens, and, a philosopher.
I'm so interested in like trauma and the nervous system. And you said that chapter 3 is about that. Can you like speak more to that? Like how does trauma get entangled with the nervous system?
Sure. There is sort of some definitions of trauma that can be really helpful. And I think in our field where there's a group of people really trying to come together in the psychological community to almost have this in the DSM, which is sort of the Bible of psychologists and therapists, if you will. But they like to define religious trauma as, and this is from the several people, but in part from the Religious Trauma Institute and Catherine Keller and Anna Clark Miller. So I always want to give credit to people who are doing this, but they define it as the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope and return to a sense of safety. So trauma is like a violent sucker punch to our mind and body that leaves us reeling and wondering what the heck just happened. And it has these sort of lasting effects. And so in regards to trauma and the nervous system, our nervous system's primary purpose is to keep us alive and free from pain. So think of the imprints in terms of what happens when a child touches a hot stove. The shock of that scorching heat's aftermath is a constant reminder, fear the stove, do not touch. Likewise, the imprint of the diabolical Trinity would say, fear God, do not sin. And so it's deeply within our nervous system for good reason, because its role is to not make us forget about that which can be so harmful. And the idea of an omnipotent God who can instantly snap his fingers, catapulting into a afterlife called hell, where there's eternal torment for 100, 1,000, 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion times infinity years, is maddening to our nervous system. Yeah. So that's a little piece on why that's so, has such effects in that way.
Yeah. Well, and it goes so deep, and I'm going to use a personal example if I can. Like we've been very forthcoming about our religious trauma, if you will, but something happened at my workplace last week that like brought all that trauma back. And it wasn't even in the same like capacity, but the I don't know what you would say, but the people that were involved, it was very similar. And so and at first it was like that, kind of like that sucker punch again, like you were talking about, where, it's just like, what is going on? This, something was said to me, and it was just like, almost like my brain could not comprehend it. And then the more I thought about it, as the week went on, I was like, wow, this really reminded me of some of the things that happened inside the church. And so I guess my question is, like, if it's in our nervous system, is it always going to be a part of our nervous system, like as a protection? And if so, like, can we ever get to a place where it's not so detrimental? And I will say that I was able to cope and recover much better because of all the work that I've done with the religious trauma aspect of it. But it's still like, still really, really rocked my world.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a heart that's always wanting to avoid being a guru who's promoting some kind of snake oil stuff,
Sure.
I'm one who says we can experience healing, but for many of us, there's a phrase I call sort of phantom theology. And you may have heard of a phantom limb syndrome, a condition wherein after an amputation, people experience sensations of a limb that's no longer there. So similarly, despite no longer believing in hell and that maybe we're evil and depraved, at times those phantom ideas can sneak up on us and cause a lot of suffering. But there is principles, pathways, and practices that have been sort of encapsulated through neuroscience that can help us not only understand trauma, but help us sort of bring a large degree of healing. But I'm also one that says, for many of us, we just bring it along with us. It's sort of like you're driving a bus, and on the bus is the passengers of the past or passengers within yourself that maybe you might have one part that's still a little frayed. Or you might have, of course, a part that's very confident and that's bullshit, but you might have an anxious part, a depressed part, still a slight fundamentalist part, a Buddhist part, a liberal part. But they're all on the bus. And can us as the main drivers of that bus, can we drive to our destination, engaging in our values, even though some of those parts of us may still be there? Yeah. So I'm an advocate for healing. And I'm also a realist, saying that for many of us, this trauma could have lasting effects. And in the meantime, can we know who we are, what our values are, experience a level of healing that's good enough to be able to go out in the world and be our imperfect, beautiful selves?
Yeah. And I agree with that. And I feel like in those moments where, I don't know, for lack of a better word, for me, when I'm triggered or a situation happens like it did at work this past week, for me to try to take a moment to go inside and to reflect and to, I guess, try to find the truth that there is about me, instead of maybe believing externally what has been said or insinuated. So I would agree with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so astute, because it's so helpful to know our triggers. Mm-hmm. Because triggers it's sort of like if we have a bruise on our arm and somebody's walking by and they brush up again, ouch, what the? And so that trigger, it also brings up, there's a saying that's the soul knows no time. And so what happened years ago in that moment could be brought up as if it's happening once again.
Yes.
Right. So that's exactly what the trigger is. Mm-hmm. And then the problem is sometimes we can get triggered and it can be so overwhelming. We don't know what's going on. It's so global. I feel effed up. I'm not okay. I just feel hurt, angry. I don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. But then to be able to slow it down, mm-hmm. and this is usually done with a compassionate witness, whether a therapist or a friend, to know, what is being triggered? And then to know, what are the thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations that are occurring with this trigger? Because it's a state.
Right.
State many times dictates story. So what's the story? What's this narrative? And then now, as I like to think of in the Buddhist tradition, in some writers, they talk about a bird and with two wings, one with a acceptance, being mindful of what is, and the other wing being compassion. So how can I know what's happening with me with a spirit and attitude of compassion and acceptance, but also the engaging in a compassionate activity, whether it's a simple, let me just hold my hand to my heart and let me acknowledge that this is a moment of suffering, and let me acknowledge that other people suffer in similar ways. And may I just say kind things to myself. May I be okay. May I know that I will get through this. And that's sort of a self-regulation strategy, but also co-regulation, mm-hmm. calling somebody up. Hey, I just got triggered. I feel like I'm a hot mess. Can you just be with me in this moment?
Sounds
that's good.
Like some of the shadow work that we've done mm-hmm. Is like that too. And when we're with that part of us that's trying to resolve this, mm-hmm. and we can be with them, like you say, in presence, compassion, without judgment, then something shifts. And that part of us never goes away, like you guys were talking about. But a lot of people use the word integration now. It's integrated, with us. And so we're still triggered.
Right.
Take a second and breathe, but something shifts to where we're using our modern day coping mechanisms instead of our 5-year-old coping mechanisms,
Yeah, beautifully said.
So I want to ask another question though. Laura and I talk about our book Out in the Desert a lot, and we're doing podcasts. We've done 240 of these podcasts. So we usually lately get into talking about the effectiveness of the church, because our book is designed to do that, to just take a hard look at the subject that I end up writing about. It's kind of been a discovery since I left church, was this idea that the blog I wrote that related to all that says why church generally doesn't heal our trauma. That's the title. Finally found it in my mind.
Oh, got it. Mm-hmm.
Why church, and so we end up talking about that in chapters of the Out in the Desert book. We end up talking about it on podcasts and so on. And it seems that churches draw people to them that are wounded. Churches intend to help them, and the person wants them to. And they claim that they can, and I think they intend to. I don't know that most pastors have bad motives or anything. There's a few we know about, but most of them don't intend to do bad. But then we have issues within the church, such as Sarah Bessie said, the church didn't have room for my grief. There's no time for it. in the scheduling. I can't stop the service and say, I'm in pain. Can you talk to me? The organization comes first. The organization takes up 70 or 80% of the assets and the you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And
totally.
So there's no time for my grief. And we call it a family, but it's sometimes not like a family.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah. It's like that family or and all those things. But just generally, the church does things like bypassing and the things we've talked about. But generally, they don't get it done. They're not getting it done. They're not healing our trauma. Yet, so we talk in our books, like, I'm not gonna tell anybody not to go to church, but I'm saying there's an issue. Can you expand on that and say that better than I can?
No, listen, I think you're doing great. This is good stuff to wrestle through. And it's complicated. There's so many nuances to this pie chart of church and how it affects us and its function and dysfunction. I'm still wrestling through that too. I have different parts of me, and one part can be very burn it all down, in pyro-theological fashion. Another part of me sees that there is potential, and I'm not naive that there are healthier churches than others, which is why I don't like to talk in a global sense. The church is hard for me because there's so many good, healthier churches, healthier pastors. For example, I have a friend I went to school with, Rich Velotis, who, was the pastor beforehand, the emotionally healthy church, emotionally healthy spirituality. And so he took that church over from Pete Scazzaro. And my goodness, I mean, it's all about holistic health. Like Pete told him, your family comes first. Pete told him, I don't want you to overwork. I want you to take rest. I want you to take Sabbath. Like all of these healthy principles. I want you to have people surrounding you. I don't want you to be an island to yourself. And so they have all these incredible programs for the community. I think they're getting funds right now to have a facility in the community for physical health and stuff like that. So what can I say about that? It's like, that's cool. Now, is it an outlier? Potentially. And are there a lot of churches? There are churches with authoritarian, narcissistic leaders that just need to freaking stop. It's so toxic and unhealthy and sick. It just needs to be, taken out in the backyard and shot. And then there's, churches in the middle, churches on the other end of the spectrum. But invariably, so it's just a spectrum. But I think in large part, what I've learned, this is just my experience, is that I had to learn that my Pentecostal church that caused so much destruction and trauma in my life, to not end my journey there, because it's frozen in time, because as I was being more honest, I was like, oh, there are healthier churches, but I was still stuck in, no, F the church, burn it down. And so I had to tell myself, okay, some people are doing this healthier, and you can't just, split the church all bad, because then you're engaging in a defense mechanism yourself. So there's all kinds of layers and churches in different spaces and places, but I'm all for health. And so whatever church has unhealthiness and dysfunctionality, let's freaking deal with it ASAP.
I think an important thing is too, and this is one thing that we really, try to, promote when we're talking about our particular book, is like, we want there to be a conversation. We want people to take like a serious look, because a lot of times what we hear is, well, I'm sorry that happened to you, but that's not how our church is. And that very well may be true. It very well may be. But I also have been, in work situations where we fake ourselves out, we're already doing that. But, and that may partially be true, but I just feel like for churches to be healthy, like the one that you're talking about, they're intentional about that, right? You have to be intentional.
That's right.
I mean, that's the word that came to my mind when you started sharing about, the emotionally healthy church in that study, because we had gone through that study at a church. But again, you can go through the motions and take yourself out. You really have to be intentional and take a hard look and like be okay with saying, we're not there yet. What do we need to do in order to, take the next step to becoming a more healthy place for people to congregate. So,
and we need, Karl and Laura, we need your voices, because there's different voices we need. You may have a prophetic voice that is really calling the church to task, and another one, like me, I may have a slightly more, and maybe because I'm a therapist, just a little bit more compassionate, slower, but I think we need all the voices. So I think a problem arises when we judge others for not having our disposition. But gosh, I look at your work and I'm like, gosh, the church needs it. To call it out. You both actually do it in a compassionate way, yet you don't pull any punches. And so your voices are hugely needed. So I appreciate that as well.
Same.
Once we were talking about in our book, talking about being addicted to church. Before you mentioned dependencies, right? There becomes a dependency. Can you talk a little bit more about that? It was in our second chapter of the book, and the thought is anything you do that alters your mood can become addictive. And we set up kind of these patterns that it's kind of like the first one's on me, and you will become. But I tell people, if people are in church, they say, I'm not addicted to church, but can you imagine during your normal church days ever not going to church when you're even on vacation, or if we miss 1 week, we're falling apart. What do you think about that? About being addicted?
Yeah, this is, I'm wrestling as you talk about it, addiction or just like trauma bond, and like fear, because people going to church is, or not going to church is like more, I hear more people struggle with guilt. And so it's more done out of guilt than it is, but it also leads to, if you want to get into the addiction, I talk about church factitious disorder, and not to get too much in the details, but there is this sick system in a way where you have people in the church telling people, infusing them with poison, but us not knowing it's poison, and then them trying to give us the medicine, right? So they're perpetually keeping us sick. And this could be, the sermons, like, the medication supposedly directed at our pain and shame and fear. We were told that we're paralyzed by sin, that we're sick inside and we could do nothing good at all, that our feelings were instruments of the devil, that our bodies couldn't be trusted. All of this sort of infusing us with this sickness, and then saying, we have the cure. Let me give you the medication of sermons and worship music, but it creates this perpetual pattern of keeping us sick by reminding us we're sick sinners, and constantly giving us what they deem as the medication. And it's a sick system. I mean, everything. And you literally, you sell anything with fear, and so fear I'm not going to be popular, fear I'm not the best, fear that I'm not good looking enough or whatever, fear of dying is a big one. And then hell and the devil and all of those
those things that I think they figured out back in the 1920s, and Billy Sunday and all those guys. They needed, someone big and loud to get up and yell at us and tell us if they added fear. And the modern thing I use is we've been, since the 80s, we've been taught to fear Russia. Mm-hmm. And now Russia invaded Ukraine. It was a terrible thing, but that was basically an unarmed country, and they couldn't take them over yet. We were, deathly afraid that they were coming for us. And it was mainly due to preachers trying to sell things, trying to sell the solution.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe arms dealers. They're making out pretty well, I think, right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. The tool of fear. Lately, I've been on this kick of trying to understand religion in a more global perspective, historical, and then to trace it from way back, the earliest forms of religious sensibilities in the form of animism, sort of imbuing these sort of spiritual qualities to everything that exists, to then moving from the hunter-gatherers to the shaman, which as communities began to be more sort of settling down to more agriculture and farming and that of nature, there need to be more rules to create cohesiveness so communities wouldn't fall apart or so they couldn't get killed by other tribes and stuff. But then the shaman and how the role of the shaman, and this goes back, my goodness, how many thousands of years, well before, Christianity and Jewish thought. But the notion of using fear as a tactic to promote cohesion within the community, I mean, that's so old, and it hasn't stopped. And whether it's the shaman or the preacher, it's just as a tool to use to, promote homogeneity. Everyone be the same, look the same, cookie cutter Christians. And but I'm aware of their tactics. I think you guys are as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think Laura has a question.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to your book, Divine Echoes.
Snap. Yeah, I love that book.
Okay, let's take a moment. Let's pause. Let's think. Okay. So I know that, I've read this book and I remember emailing you. So this is a while ago. It was probably before we even wrote our book. So it was over 2 years ago. Okay. So it's called Divine Echoes, Reconciling Prayer with the Uncontrolling, love of God. So just to give a little background, what was it? It was like 5 years ago now. Our daughter was pregnant with our grandson, and at 20 weeks, she called me and said they see some things on the ultrasound, and we're going to get more information, but I don't want to say it doesn't look good, but because he's here and he's amazing. But we knew there would be some birth defects, if you will. There would be some disabilities. So I remember in that moment just being like, I cannot pray. And yet it was like I was having this internal struggle. Like, I can't pray because, number one, I'm not going to sit. What if I don't say the right words? What if I don't pray long enough? But the other part of me was like, but if you don't pray, and he's not, and I'm using air quotes, he's not healed. Then, so either way I was losing, whether I prayed or not, if he wasn't quote unquote healed, this was my fault. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to that, because I still struggle with the whole idea of prayer. And I think it's because I don't have the right definition, if you will, or I don't have the right idea about what prayer is. Prayer is kind of, to me, like a bad word, if you will. Like, there's no winning. It's begging for something. rather than what it's really supposed to be. So can you speak to that?
Yeah,
Can you help me
yeah.
maybe understand that a little bit? And I will say you did respond to my email all those years ago, but I want to have this conversation in case there's out there that maybe has had the same situation come up in their life.
Yeah. I mean, first, I just feel an ache as you talk about it, because there's so much disorientation and fear and confusion on what's up with this whole prayer thing. So I mean, for me, prayer, I don't even know. I just don't like to use the word. For those, if I'm teaching within a Christian community, I'd rather just say talking, talking to God, whether internally or externally. But a lot of people have saw Divine Echoes and Mark, why did you deconstruct it? Like, what's the point? It's such a nuanced conversation, but the whole point and thrust of that book was, if God is not in control of all things, if God's love is uncontrolling, if, God can't just, and God doesn't have is not embodied and is a spirit, and so doesn't have literal hands and feet or vocal cords, what does that mean for prayer? Then you see how many people, like my mom passed away, and I'm praying for her, and my brother's in prison, and I prayed for him, and fasting and prayer. Like, what the hell is the point? And so thinking through that, I just came to realize that prayers can't they can't be in the context of thinking God is a genie. And maybe God just simply can't do things. Maybe God, with all the prayers that I have, can't stop a gunman about to shoot somebody, because God doesn't have a body and can't physically. Now that gets into, well, wow, maybe we are the literal hands and feet of God. So in that way, maybe God can, as God's only instruments is through mediums, because God is spirit, and that medium being human beings. But God works through animals and other things as well. So what's the point of prayer? I'm a little skeptical that it can effectively, demonstrably change outcomes, given the parameters and the experience that we have with God's love being uncontrolling. So I'm in a minority camp in that way, even amongst process theologians. I'm only a realist, in that sense. And so, Mark, if it can't affect change demonstrably because God's love is, uncontrolling, well, then it comes about that maybe it really affects us. And maybe there's something about proximal prayer, where we're literally praying for somebody in the moment, face to face. And that's because of touch, and that's because of this encounter that we're having between each other and the community. And I think maybe God's spirit can do something that's quite different than me praying in my room for Aunt Mary, who's thousands of miles away, who may not be privy to my prayers in the first place. And I just don't think my words as they leave my mouth will demonstrably change God. Now, Thomas Ord, emphasized that because God is relational, that it can affect God, that somehow provides God energies as such that it could do something different than if we didn't pray. But I in correspondence, I'm still skeptical, and I don't know what energies mean. And I just, okay, let's say it can affect God. But for me, it's sort of like if we had a dropper and dropped a drop of water in an ocean, doesn't make the ocean wetter. So maybe it does affect God, in that God cares and God's heart is affected. But whether or not God can, I heard Mark say heal Aunt Mary, I'm going to download something to Aunt Mary or physically change cells in her body against cells' wills in some way. I just have a hard time for that. So the bottom line is, maybe prayer can be efficacious for ourselves, and maybe talking to God can be just a deeply relational act, as we would maybe you talk to Karl, Did it have a demonstrable effect on the outcome of certain events? No. But is it a loving experience to just share your heart with somebody who cares? Maybe so.
Yeah. I think for me, in this particular incident that I'm talking about, it really caused me to rethink what I believe to be, or what I needed something to be normal, healed, whatever. Because like I said, our grandson is here. Does he have disabilities? Yes. Is he still like, the most amazing, ornery, almost 5-year-old kid? Absolutely. I love him to death. And I don't look at him like he is less than. So I've been able to like reconcile that in me. So I feel like that particular, issue that I had to go through allowed me to kind of rethink that. But I really do appreciate you explaining that, because I think that, going back to trauma and things like that within some churches, most churches, however you want to say that, prayer is kind of used as a weapon. It's like you are told, well, you didn't have enough faith, or you didn't pray enough, or you didn't get enough people to pray, or like there's some magical number or words, but no one tells you what they are, and so you're just
or money. Don't forget about the money.
So I really do appreciate you expanding on that. That was selfishly for me, but hopefully somebody else can.
I started to think of prayer a couple I don't know when, but I was doing some centering prayer, which is much like meditation without an intention, just sitting. And then began to describe prayer for me as connection. And like, why do I pray for someone else? Really to connect with them, more than anything. And when you pray beside someone, you can feel that pretty intensely. That
right.
So I see it as connection. And then, Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within you. And if it's in all my cells, then it's connected. It's not, you are connected with whatever God is. And so you can't be any closer than being connected. Thereby, however God's made up, he's probably not anthropomorphic, like you said, his spirit in all things. That's in the Bible. Then I'm connected, and I can't be any more connected than connected. And whatever's connected ought to be in sync with me, right? If something's connected to me, like my arm or my heart, or then we can sense each other, and we can't be any closer. So what do I have to beg for? What do I have to get other people to connect me with whatever God is? I do that by going inside. And since we were taught not to go inside, that's why we have the problem sometimes. But I just see it more as connection. It's my
totally. Yeah. And it's sort of how do we become more aware of that which is?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's quite the feat in and of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, we usually ask people this question, and we don't give them any. We didn't prep you for any of the questions, so you've done fine. If you had a billboard that everybody could see, what would you write on your billboard? Everybody in the world can see it. It's yours. You can say whatever you want. There's not going to be any repercussions. But what would you have to say to the world?
Karl, it's such a Now I'm thinking too deeply about it. I want it to be like my grand manifesto, but it would have something to do with love. That's all I could say.
Yeah.
Love just is, anything that can spur and encourage us to truly love one another.
Yeah.
And that's good to me, man.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
So how can people get a hold of you? Give you one last chance to promote your book. Where can they find it? Share all these things with us.
Sure. The Diabolical Trinity hopefully will be on Amazon and all kinds of stores come March 28th. Right. So hopefully they'll be here.
About the time this releases.
Yeah. And so I'm sort of a social media dinosaur, and I have an aversion to selling things. So I'm not very good at that stuff. But Facebook, that shows how dinosaur I am. You can always connect with me through Facebook or my site, markgregorykarris.com. And like I said, receive some of my books through Amazon.
Great.
It's been great having you on today.
It's been a really good conversation.
Great being here.
Yeah.
Right. For everybody out there, his name is Mark Karris. That's Karris. We thank you for tuning in today. We want to remind you, as always, to be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace. We'll see you later.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary. We hope you find who you are as you embark on your own journey.
For all of us here at the Desert Sanctuary, be who you are, be where you are, and be at peace.